Hello. Well, we're at the end of a long day, end of a long week. Those of you who were not able to be with us in class due for reasons that are entirely your own, I just want you guys to know that we missed you. We had a lot of fun in class today. A lot of fun, all the days, but they were pretty jam-packed with a lot of stuff. This is a recap about drywall. Now, before we go any further in this video, make sure you take a look at the links below that detail some of the information about where drywall comes from, what it is, how old it is, what it's made of, some information about the thickness of it. Now, that video is a how it's made video. I like it, it's a really good one. The other video that I'm going to be attaching to this post is, well, it's a picture of me in a green jacket standing in what looks like a really rustic shed. That video is me in my back shed talking about insulation in the walls. That is the step that happens before you put the drywall up. You've got to make sure you have a thermal barrier, but that's all just detailed in that video, so take a look at that video as well. This video is the third and final video in the drywall module. What I have here is a display board that has all of the different steps in the process of drywall. And we're going to give you the Coles Notes version of the lesson that we covered, well, in our drywall day, our long day today, and a little bit yesterday for Quad B. It starts with drywall. You've been made aware of where drywall comes from, what it's made of, and you're aware of the fact that there are several different thicknesses and types. That's this part right here. The different types, there was mentioned in that how-to video that there's a moisture-resistant one, usually identified by color, blue, green. It's an aqua blue or a marine green. That indicates that it's got a moisture, not moisture barrier, but more of a moisture resistance to it. And what we talked about in class is they usually use those in bathrooms, maybe backsplashes in kitchens. Behind your shower stall walls, you'll find this, or maybe a different material, but you can use this, and then onto this you put your PVC sheeting, or you put your tiling, or whatever type of finish you'd like in your bathroom shower, or your bathroom, or your bathtub. So the different types of drywall, I guess you could drop all the different types of drywall into several different categories. Moisture resistant, non-moisture resistant. The thicker it gets, they'll add different different materials to the composition of it to beef up the strength of it. There's even a lot of it now is fire rated. A lot of it has to do with the thickness of it. What they've done is they've tested the drywall under very specific conditions, very scientific conditions, and they have determined that it is good for so long of a burn time, which means that if there's a fire in, say, an apartment, and there is 2 layers of drywall that is appropriate and follows code that separates the 2 apartments, you can be fairly certain, or almost certain, that there's a good amount of time before the fire in this apartment goes through the wall, burns the drywall away, and starts burning the second apartment. It gives the people in the other apartment time to escape. And that, according to fire code, is absolutely mandatory. Now, the drywallers, some time ago, many years ago, were given a lot of new contracts because they said now the fire barrier, it doesn't have to be a steel door or some other material in the walls, it can be drywall. And all of a sudden in commercial construction and residential construction, they went crazy. It was excellent for the trade. They started putting up drywall everywhere, and they're the go-to people for fire barriers between residences. It's fantastic. So there's different thicknesses, like we talked about. There's different compositions, but there's different thicknesses and there's different papers. In order to cut the drywall, if you were in class, you would discover that drywall is nothing but chalk in the middle. Like it's chalk, just dusty chalk. And trying to break it is pretty tough. That's why it's hard to punch a hole in your wall, despite what all the teenage boys in class are trying to want to do when they damage the wall. Can I punch a hole with my fist? No, because it's very tough to do. Instead, what we have to do to break drywall, to cut it to size, is we just have to, let me do this, score the paper. You break the paper, and then next thing you know, easy to break. Then you cut the back side of the paper, and it breaks along that cut line. It's much, much easier to do it that way than to smash it with a fist. So that's how drywall gets cut to size. There's a couple of different tools. One's a very aggressive drywall saw, but most of the time it's what some people call an Olfa knife. It's a brand name for a blade, or an X-Acto knife, box cutter, all the different types of names that describe pretty much the same thing. A sharp tool, is excellent. Makes your job very, very easy. Cutting with these is pretty tough because there's not a straight line you can follow, so it has a tendency sometimes, depending on how you're pulling it, to cut over. So be very careful when you're using a knife to cut drywall. You really could slice your hand open in a fraction of a second. So that being said, let's move on to the next step. How do we stick the drywall to the wall? Drywall goes on the wall with screws. Now it can either go into a wooden stud or a steel stud. And if you take a look online, I should have them here, but I don't. But the wooden studs are 2x4s, 2x6s. Steel studs are bent metal frames. All right? Now, if you hold on just a second, I'll go grab one. If I got back within just a few seconds, it's only because I edited out some of that blank dead air. We talked about the knife that we used to cut the drywall. Here's the drywall knife that we use. That's a dedicated, really aggressive saw. Check this out. She goes through pretty good. This is how you can make a hole right in the center of a piece of drywall. So that is a very aggressive drywall saw, or aggressive saw. Works really, really well. Anyway, getting back to the screws. How we put the screws into the wooden frames, we use a coarse threaded screw. Now that coarse threaded screw has the threads on the screw that are separated very far apart. It really looks about as coarse as a deck screw. Now the deck screw digs into the wood, embeds itself, pulls it tight, holds the drywall right nice and tight to it. But here's a steel stud. It's made out of extremely thin metal, bent, and the shape that it's bent into gives it a little bit of rigidity. Now you may think that the drywall walls, or the walls that hold up the drywall, are going to be really flimsy. I mean, look at this. I'm twisting this 2x4. Well, this replacement 2x4, this alternate 2x4. But once you put drywall on here, then another stud, another stud, another stud connected to a top plate, bottom plate, and some cross bracing, some interior bracing, this becomes a very solid wall. But the benefit is it's extremely light, really easy to work with. Metal snips are what the actual framers use. Instead of a saw to cut wood to build your frame, they have handheld metal snips, no power required. Cut it to size, screw it together with a small little cordless drill and a tiny, tiny little screw. It's surprising how strong this is. But because it's made of this tiny, tiny, thin metal, it requires a different type of screw to make the drywall fasten correctly to the steel studs. That's a fine thread. Now, if you take a look at screws that are used in machines, they're very, very small threads, really, really small, tight windings, not very good for wood. But what they have a tendency of doing, what they really like, is that when they drill into the steel, it punctures the steel, because it's thin enough to puncture, but strong enough to hold. It punctures the steel, and when those threads go in, if you understand what I mean when I say it taps a hole and puts something similar to a thread on the steel itself, well, you're basically threading it in. Now, it does not allow you to put the screw in and out because it makes the hole too big and the screw becomes too sloppy. But when you fasten the drywall to a steel stud, it goes in nice and tight and it holds. And those fine threads really tighten up the connection between the steel stud and the drywall. It's very handy. Steel studs also have a lot of holes like this throughout the entire length of it. It's not for anything other than putting cross bracing in. You can see this little notch right here. To stop the wall from wobbling back and forth, they have a steel U-channel that runs along the inside of all these 2x4 steel studs. By the way, 2x4, they are the same dimension as a 2x4. And if you remember what that is, 3.5 by 1.5 inches. So we've got this little notch right here, and they lay a U-channel all the way across of a heavier gauge steel, and that fastens this, the wall in place, gives it a little bit of rigidity. These other holes are for plumbing and electrical wires to go through. Because if you have wooden studs, you have to drill holes all the way through. Well, they don't make trees with prefabbed holes, but they can make steel studs with prefabbed holes, and they do. It makes the job a lot easier. So now we've got steel studs, which are easier to carry, much easier to work with, faster by far. They're non-flammable, which is like a huge bonus. They're very strong, and you can make them out of recycled materials. Pretty good, and that's why they're so very, very common in commercial construction, and I'm sure, although it's not my expertise, residential construction as well. The other thing about the screws, there's coarse threads, there is fine threads. The other thing is that there are several different diameters of the thread. They're in categories of 6 and 7 and 8, and that refers to the diameter of the shank of the screw itself, which basically translates to how strong is your screw. 8 is big. Now if you contrast this to the electrical gauge wire is in the opposite order, but don't confuse you here. This is not in gauges, this is numbers. It's a different rating system. The screws are in number 6, number 7, number 8. There's number 10 screws out there, but for drywall, most common ones are 6, 7, and 8. 6 being the smallest, and 7, then 8 is the largest of this group that I have gathered right here. The lengths are different as well based on how far you have to go into drywall or how thick your drywall is. Remember back here we talked about 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/8, and sometimes multiple layers. I've seen 1-inch drywall double layer. Heavy stuff, but you're going to need a very long screw to go through all of that to fasten it to the studs behind. Moving on, after it's been fastened in place and laid in place, remember the way that we laid the plywood on the floor of a structure. They have to coincide, the seams have to coincide with the center of the studs, which makes it extremely important to make sure your studs are spaced according to the 3 spacing standards, 12, 16, or 24. After the studs, or after the drywall is up, you're going to have 2 pieces of drywall butted up to each other. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the different types of joints, but just suffice it to say, I always wanted to say phrases like that, there is a factory edge that has a kind of a slight dip down, and then when you cut an edge, it's just exactly, for this case, 1/2 inch thick. This would be a little less than 1/2 inch thick. And I won't go into detail about that, but if you want to ask me next time you're in class, please do so, and we'll go into detail about why the factory edge has a dip down, kind of recessed part of the piece of drywall. But you have to cover up those seams. Now what you cover up those seams with is drywall mud and drywall tape. There's several different types of things you can use to bridge the gap between 2 pieces of drywall that may have a small little gap running along the length of it. You put mud on the wall, then the most common is paper tape. The paper tape sticks to the mud. The mud is wet. The moisture in the mud soaks into the paper sticks on, and we got a nice little marriage like a Band-Aid or a cast. First layer goes on to stick the tape down. Second layer, after you've sanded it a little smooth, you put another coat of drywall mud on over top to cover up the tape. But the tape is operating as some kind of a bridge, a little bit of reinforcement, and then the sanding can begin of the drywall mud to make it nice and smooth. You got a beautiful wall. The other options for bridging that gap instead of the paper tape, the most cost-effective paper tape, is what you can barely see right here, but picture a fiberglass mesh, your screen door, but it's clear, like it's white, and it's sticky on one side. So all you do is you peel it off the roll, cut it, stick it, and then mud over top of it. No need to put mud behind because the mud's gonna go through the holes and stick to the wall. It is an excellent reinforcement. It's like 4 times the price. It's crazy expensive. But if you're only doing a little bit, it's very, very strong. And what we did in class is we used, we discussed 2 different methods of repairing big holes in the wall. Now, this hole in the wall is too big for a piece of tape to go over. It's definitely too big to take a little piece of drywall mud and go and fill in the hole. Too big. The big chunk of drywall will dry and fall out. So you have to bridge this gap. But what you'll find is you'll have a hole in your wall, but your stud is over here and your stud is over here. There's nothing to screw a patch to. So what we did is we put a piece of wood behind, we screwed it to the drywall so that this piece of wood is now behind the drywall, and it's just fastened to the drywall, and it operates as a wooden rear support. And then you get a piece of patch, and you put it into the hole, screw it to the wood, and then you drywall over top of the gap that exists only around the hole. And that's an exercise we did in class if you weren't here. That being said, now that your drywall patch has been done, There's also another way to think about it. You can buy these prefab patches don't try this on big holes, but it is a big square of fiberglass mesh that's sticky. But on the front, you can see that it's got this wire mesh, this metal, it's very thin, but it's stronger than just the fiberglass. That goes on right over top of the hole, and you just mud right over top of that. It's not that strong. There's no backing to it, but it will look just fine. This will get you out of a pinch. Say if you put a hole in the wall of your apartment and you're moving and you don't want to have to pay to fix it, you just get one of these little quick patches, poop, move out, and you get your deposit back. After the drywall mud is up, the tape is up, the bridges have been set, and the gaps have been spanned, you have to make it smooth because you don't want a stucco wall. That's like way 1980s. You've got different types of sanding options. Sandpaper, you know. The different types of sandpaper or the different grits of sandpaper will give you the texture you desire based on what you're looking for. And if you talk to a professional painter, they are looking for a specific type of finish on the wall, and that depends on what type of paint they're putting on. So if they want a high sheen, they're going to want a smooth wall. If it's a low luster, some kind of a satin finish, they may not be so picky. The painters may say, no, you know what, that's fine, 120 is going to be good enough. Or if they want a nice high sheen, they may want to say, make sure the drywall is sanded down to a 180 or a 220. You never know. Working with other trades is extremely important. So the finish you leave behind is setting up the beginning stages of the next trade coming along. Like I said, the painters, maybe the wallpaperers. So how we go about sanding down is a whole art in and of itself as well. Just like applying the mud, that has to be seen and experienced. I could not explain that in detail here. Just know that you're going to be frustrated when you try it for the first time. I'm frustrated for the 1000th time. I'm not a professional drywaller, but I do respect the art, and you should too. But try it, and then you'll respect them even more. Sandpaper, a variety of different grits, and they're just fine. Put them on a block, put them on a pad. There's a lot of different tools you can use to have a big wide surface so you can sand across wide spots of the wall to get it sanded smooth and even, long strokes. Same thing can be said for the sanding blocks. They come in all shapes and sizes. And this stuff is really good too. This is sanding screen. It comes in different grits just like sandpaper, although not the same variety of grits of sandpaper. The variety of grits are maybe less than half a dozen that I've ever seen, probably not even that many. But what they do is they fasten to a handheld device like a plastic handle, and they're about 9-10 inches long, about 3.5-4 inches wide. They breathe very well, which means as it sands off the drywall dust, it falls to the ground. It doesn't stick to this screen because it's open. It's more than just, well, it's very porous. So it falls to the ground. These last a very long time, and they're very, very good. Usually drywallers have them on the end of a long 8-foot pole, and when they're sanding a wall, they're not doing this. They're going whoosh, 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 along seams, and they cover a lot of ground. Remember, drywalling is very lucrative, but it's only lucrative if you take the time to get good at it. Anybody who's done drywall realizes they probably couldn't make a living at it unless they learned how to do it right the first time. And I'll finish with this. In order to properly respect the trade of drywalling, you have to go to the mudding stage. Well, the cutting stage and applying the boards is frustrating in and of itself, making sure that they're square and true. But when it comes to the mudding, you apply the mud. A professional drywaller will do 2 coats. They'll put a coat on, or she'll put a coat on. They will put a coat on. They will apply the tape with that first layer of mud, and they'll walk away. The first coat is to make sure that the tape sticks and it's got enough adhesive to be securely fastened to the wall. They come back the next day, they do a light sanding. And I say light sanding because they know exactly how much to put on, and they didn't put on too much. Then they put a second coat on that hides the tape, fills in all the gaps, and blends it smoothly with the rest of the surface of the drywall. And when they're done on their second coat, there may be a small ridge here and there. So on the following day, which is day 3, they come back and they look at the wall and they just touch with the sandpaper, get those small little imperfections off, and they're done. You and I, it would be a 5 or 6 step process. And when you get paid by the board foot that you put up, the faster you put it up, the more money you make. And these individuals make a ton of money. So consider that when you're choosing your career after high school. Thanks for listening.